So I'm going to talk about some work that we've been doing nationally, and one of the reasons that I'm here, I've actually been kind of on a little road show to a variety of different groups, kind of talking about this effort, and really, very importantly, trying to bring people in. There's a lot of amazing work that's been done. You've heard a bunch today on thinking about competencies. So in various communities, so obviously computational biology and bioinformatics, very closely related data science, translational informatics. I would argue, given my training, statistical genetics and statistics, we overlap a great deal in thinking about these issues. And so as part of this new coordinating center, which is the CTSA Center for Data to Health, or CD2H, and all the sites that are in green are actually sites that are part of that coordinating center. This was funded by NIH and NCATS to basically try and facilitate the activities of the CTSA centers. There's 60 of them across the country. And this is really focused on informatics, so it's highly relevant to the work that we're doing here at ISMB and at ICB. The guiding principles should look familiar because I think they're things that are near and dear to all of our hearts. You'll notice that things like FAIR are up there, thinking about evidence-based, thinking about engagement. And the methods, as you'll notice, since it's a coordinating center, are really for the CD2H, are really to facilitate activities. So we're not trying to be prescriptive, we're not trying to take over, and in fact, very much we want to engage with the groups that are already doing this work within the CTSA informatics community and outside. And that's one of the reasons that I'm here, besides the fact this is one of the societies that I also belong to. So I'm the lead for education and learning innovation, and this is a cross-cutting work group. We also look very closely to a task force, if you think about it, because we cut across the entire coordinating center, and our activities are kind of nicely summarized here. So when it comes to competencies, we have no intention of developing new competencies, and really the effort has been on just identifying and trying to harmonize and map across all the amazing work that's been done. So we've talked a lot, and you've seen a lot of examples today, both internationally as well as the original ones that have been updated for bioinformatics curriculum within ISCB. AMIA, for example, has a great deal of work in this area. And so I've listed a number of the groups. This is not exhaustive, where we've really tried to reach out and make sure that we're both from an attribution standpoint and to really understand what this landscape looks like. And that's what I'm going to focus on in a few minutes after I get through this about CD2H. You'll notice there's a couple of other pieces that are on here. Very much it's focused on this idea of how do we think about interdisciplinary collaboration, open science, and entrepreneurship in terms of education. So what do we really need to do to stimulate or incubate that? Also very similar to the work that Vera talked about, we do want to make sure that the resources, so if you think of the competencies, so what she showed with BioExcel is actually really important, that you want to be able to map from whatever competency framework you're looking at to where are the materials that actually align to this. So making those findable, actually being able to find them, that's essential. There have been a number of groups that have been working on that, and one of the questions is just to have a way to be able to navigate through that. And really, this is also about modeling excellence and sharing. So as I mentioned, our focus is on the CTSAs, and in the United States, there's one practically in almost any corner geographically. This is an example from Ted Ladaris and Robin Champion of a BioData Club that they had created, which basically really focused on, again, a kind of a non-prescriptive, very synergistic type of meetup. And it has three major axes, which are really important. Skill sharing, which is why many people will initially come. Also co-working on projects and community. And so the format's really interesting because one is actually something in which it's hands-on, kind of like a jamboree, and you're going to learn. And the other is much more like they call it the hacky hour. And it's really much more about socializing and community. And that has kept this, so there's incredible industry, academic, kind of a cross-sector participation in this, and also various skill levels. And to actually, if you tried to plan to do that, it's actually incredibly hard. If you said, I want to go out and have an event that's going to be really successful in bringing these groups, it's actually quite difficult. And this model has been very successful, and it's one of the types of things that we talk about when we think about how do we be able to share these ideas or these types of models in other groups. So the landscape is actually pretty tricky. This is an example that was brought up around bioinformatics and data science on using the subway map of what are the various stops or kind of these key areas that we might think about. So you can see visualization and machine learning, and then what are all the various steps. The other hard part is, of course, that all these fields that I mentioned, so if we think about this as translational informatics or bioinformatics or computational biology or any of those terms, they all involve an overlap in terms of many of the ideas, especially if you think about, and I think this is a really important point for all of these fields, you really are trying to make sure that the skills that you're applying are in the context of the domain. Computational biology and bioinformatics are great examples of that, because it's not like we're trying to do this in a vacuum. This really is, do you understand how to use these methods for these types of biological and medical problems? So that's key. So I mentioned to you that we've been reaching out to a number of various community efforts. This is only, because otherwise it would be all bulleted slides. This is just a couple of examples. ISCB is obviously on here. But there's been a tremendous amount of community effort already on thinking about competencies, thinking about training, and this is the the kind of the basis for the roadmap effort that we've been working on. So as part of that, a lot of it was just identification and attribution of prior community work on competencies, and then we've really been focused on this initial, and I want to be careful because when I use mapping, competency mapping has a very specific term, but really thinking about how do these competencies relate to each other, how can we potentially harmonize them, and then an open engagement and kind of review piece, which is our next step, which is really by all of these community partners and the CTSAs to make sure that they actually agree on how we're mapping these. And the reason for this is underneath each one of these, and so we gave the BioExcel one, you can think about a lot of the online materials that are related to bioinformatics, you can think about this definitely for AMIA. There's all these phenomenal resources, and so if we can do this, you now open up kind of this amazing plethora of different resources from these different communities that are mapping to the same competencies that you need. If you're interested in visualization, you're going to find a tremendous amount of different materials from these different communities, all in visualization, and all have something to offer. So a big piece of this, and Vera gave a great example of this, is of course not only the resource alignment, and this is very important within the CTSAs because within those 60 different centers, they've all been developing resources. A number of our partners nationally have been developing resources, but also the gap assessment. What is still missing? And then from there, there's obviously various outcomes. One of the ones that's closest to my heart is, of course, what's our prioritization for where we need to help facilitate materials and training development by CD2H, based on what's missing. So of the competency frameworks we've been looking at, there's a couple of pieces that I just thought would be important in this room to talk about. So they vary tremendously, and some of the things that I think are really helpful for the type of harmonization we're talking about is, one, do they actually have some type of structure that you can navigate? And ideally, this is a hierarchical structure with clear parent-child relationships. Not all of the competencies that we have assessed have this, but those that do, it actually makes it much easier because you can actually see the model. So remember, under every competency framework is a model. They may not explicitly say it, but there actually is one there. And if it follows this type of navigational structure, it's actually much easier for us to understand by those relationships what the underlying model is if it's not explicit. Ownership, this is a huge issue. This is not just attribution of who the people that actually help develop the competencies, but very importantly, who is responsible for them long-term within these groups. How were the competencies assessed? So this goes back to how they were developed. And also, did the groups include an assessment process for individuals? Because remember, we think about this relative to training and education, or we've seen a lot of them in terms of workforce development and job roles. And so is there a clear mapping with that as well? Has that been thought of in the framework? And then what are the commonality of competencies? Are there global competencies? This is a major one when we think about the harmonization piece. So this is an example of one of the Bloom's-based competency frameworks. This is very much focused from a workforce or job title piece. But what's very important is you'll see the Bloom's, and there's obviously different ways we could represent this, but this is the Bloom's levels at the top, and then the actual competency levels, and then the descriptors and the various tasks. This is similar to, I'll show another example of a learning profile, but this is one in which just some of the diversity that we think about in terms of the way these different frameworks have been developed and how they're represented. The nice part about this is that it is mapping back to Bloom's taxonomy, and so that actually makes it much easier when we're thinking about harmonization. Another one, and this is a really important point, so this is a four-tiered model that came up, and a very important point is that when you see the competencies at the bottom and as you go up, they're actually interdependent, they're nested. So you will have overlap across the tiers, but what they were trying to capture here was the idea that there's just things that we think about in terms of our own personal effectiveness, then there's things that we think about in terms of academic or workplace, and then there's and this was meant for an industry-wide report on data science. Then there's those that are actually meant to be industry-wide, and that might be when we think about that kind of global or common technical competencies at the top. But this tiered model actually I thought was really important because we tend to, if we don't do it formally, we tend to actually think about many of these various pieces, especially the personal effectiveness or kind of interpersonal versus the academic or industry. We also want to think about the target role. So this is an example from a panel that I was on, a national panel a couple of years ago, where they were interested in developing these skills profiles around the training needs for what they were calling big data enabled scientists. So this tells you that it's a time-stamped one because this is when we were still using that term. But what's very important here is it really is thinking about what is the target role I'm training you for. So you'll notice on the left are the various duties that you'd be performing, and then on the right are the tasks. And this was to really understand, and this is very important in a gap assessment, so this is not necessarily the competencies, but this goes hands in hand to evaluate them in terms of if this is the job, right, or this is the target role that I'm trying to train you for, how do I map that back to the competency framework to make sure? This is very dynamic and evolving, right, because these jobs will continue to change, and so that's a key piece. Another one that we already saw a couple of great examples from, most recently in the last few talks, was this idea of the personas or avatars. This is one from the paper on the bioinformatics curriculum, one of the earlier papers from ISCB. But it is this idea of really trying to understand the learner. I would make the important point that these two are distinct. A lot of people tend to think that the target role is the same thing as the learner. I actually don't agree with that. I think they're very different. I think we have to think about both roles. We need to think about the person, who they are, and the fact this is dynamic and they're continuing to learn and to train. Also what their history is, what their knowledge is, their context is going to be very important, just like the role that we're trying to train them for. Another key piece of this, and this kind of goes into the assessment piece, is this idea of individual competency indexes. So you can think of these as similar to, so for organizations you may have seen maturity indexes, and this is the same idea for actual individuals, where we're really thinking about, and this is important because this goes very much to like the KSA aspect of what is the knowledge level that they need to have, the applied skills, et cetera. So how much technical hands-on experience they need to have, what is their conceptual knowledge, and so you can see on this we're going from 0 to 4, and there are various ranges of this, with the idea of knowing absolutely nothing to being an expert. And obviously there's a lot of granularity that's not captured, but it's still important to think about these types of indices. So some of the challenges that we've noticed, and this is not exhaustive, but I just wanted to mention this when we're looking at these various competencies, frameworks from the different groups. And actually this is a comment about some of the challenges within a competency. This is actually not about the challenges mapping across, but these lead to problems. One is that often you'll find that there are highly overlapping competencies. So if you look at them, they'll often have the same indicators that are used to define different ones. So they'll be distinct, and that's not necessarily a problem, but it is something that we should be cognizant of, especially when you think about actually evaluating them or implementing them, if it's very hard to distinguish between them. Now, if it's that tiered structure that I showed you before, this actually might make more sense because you're actually thinking at a kind of a different role or a different level. But if we're just talking about within a one-tier competency framework, this can be a problem. They often can be ambiguous, muddled, inconsistent. Inconsistent is when we try to do too much in one competency, where they'll actually aggregate it or compound it, so it'll be multiple things in one. And so then the question becomes, what if one person is good at one thing but not another, but it's actually linked to the same entity? If we fail to set standards, and this is a problem when you're thinking about evaluation or assessment, if it's focused much more on outcomes but not actions, and often people will confuse this where they'll see the outcomes, which are products of good competencies, as part of the definition, but those actually aren't necessarily the same thing. Very importantly, now for a lot of the ones that we've seen today and talked about, the community is highly involved. You'll notice it's a ton of people working on this, and so they are supported, but that's always a concern, and this is something we've been very careful about, is and one of the reasons we want to leverage the community effort is they need to be supported by the groups that would use them. The larger question, as I mentioned before, is who really owns them. There's a very important concept called competency management, which is who is actually managing the competencies long term. And this often can be unclear. And then another issue, and this is one that Larry Hunter actually brought up, and the last time I saw him at a workshop around this area, was that they're often not dynamic, and this is one that comes up, they stagnate. And so actually in response to Larry, and he wasn't there at the follow-up, as part of an NLM biomedical data science initiative around curriculum, we actually thought a lot about this issue of how do we kind of solve this problem for the competency mapping. And one of the thoughts is that really most of our focus should be on the front end. So if you think about on the left, who's the learner, what's their current knowledge and skills, what's the target role we're training them for, and then the various sub-roles that might be related to that. That's going to be dynamic. That front end will change constantly. The person's going to change temporally, the roles are going to evolve. You have the ability then from that, once you understand then the goals for that individual, of mapping to the learning outcomes and the competencies, and then we have these sliders, which basically are the KSAs. You'll notice we modified them to be actually KSCT because there was this real emphasis on critical thinking with that. But the idea that based on that learner and the role, you're now thinking about which competencies do they need, and very importantly, for that context of the learner and the roles, how much do they need to know in terms of knowledge, skills, and critical thinking for each one of those. And this type of model seems like it actually would have some traction because it doesn't require the competencies to be continually reevaluated. It really is putting that all on the front end in terms of both the learner, which is going to be input by the person, and then obviously the target roles, which are evolving as we think about their career development, or workforce training. Some other things that we've thought about that I'll just briefly, because I know I'm almost out of time. There's been a lot of thoughts around how do we capture outside the box training opportunities. This is an example. You heard about the Dream Challenge from Sean's talk. This is a mini Dream infrastructure component that was created to actually be able to be used for undergraduates or graduate students so that they don't take on the full Dream Challenge. But, and this is something that Sage has developed and makes use, and that you can actually adapt for your own materials. Another key piece is better attribution, really important for education as well and for the type of works. This is one of the reasons why we really focused on this mapping or navigating to be able to figure out who's been doing this work and make sure that they're getting attribution for it. And of course, this goes back to impact as well. And then finally, because I know I'm running out of time, I just want to mention that this is open to everyone. So myself and Bill Hirsch and Justin Guinea are the leads for this work, but we would love to have people, and we've already been drawing in from the groups that I've been attending across not just the CTSAs, but also in Amy and other educator meetings. We'd love your participation and your thoughts on this, especially because we're reaching this critical phase, which will be the release of the harmonized mapping for feedback. Great. Thank you very much.
I fully agree with the attribution part, and it really ties nicely into yesterday's session on FAIR, because to get people to make those materials fair, we were having a really long discussion about incentive.
Yes.
And the attribution is the incentive part, but to make it fair, and they go hand in hand. So
yeah, and I think especially in the U.S., I think this is changing globally, but definitely in the U.S., NIH has changed the guidelines now for what the types of products are that you can get acknowledgement for, and this is really important. So as this has been expanded, the attribution becomes also important because you'll actually get credit for it in those ways.